What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 10. Final look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for this week's NFL slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL Week 10, let's take a look at the quarterback position. So at the quarterback position, you got Patrick Mahomes as one of the studs that I like. He's on fire this year, averaging 27.7 fantasy points per game on the season, scored 36, 31, and 25 fantasy points in the last 3 games. Gonna be about 14% owned, and he's projected at 27.4 fantasy points. Now he's 7,900 DraftKings salary, 600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 50.5 points scored in this game, with the Kansas City Chiefs favored by 9.5. So I like that it's going to be a high-scoring game. Now McCole Hardman is out, so it doesn't help that he lost one of his offensive wide receivers, offensive weapons. Still has Travis Kelce, and he's Patrick Mahomes. He can run for a couple of touchdowns. He got 6 rush attempts last week. So, of course, I like Patrick Mahomes here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. But let's get into some of the not-so-obvious picks. In this video, the rest of the picks here, I'm going to give you not the obvious plays at each position. Some people that are good plays, going a little bit under the radar. So, at the quarterback position, this guy's not going under the radar, but I like Tua Tagovailoa from the Miami Dolphins playing the Cleveland Browns, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Tua Tagovailoa has averaged 21.2 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 2.6 rush attempts per game. Going to be about 9% owned, projected at 19.8 fantasy points here in Week 10. He's 6,700 DraftKings salary, 1,400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Dolphins favored by 3.5. So Tua Tagovailoa has scored 27, 32, and 16 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 5, 5, and 4 rush attempts in those games. We know he has 2 fantastic wide receivers in Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. So he's got a lot of fantasy upside. So I like Tua Tagovailoa here versus the Cleveland Browns. Now the other guy has gone under the radar for the past few weeks. I've picked him every single week for the past 3 weeks. Now the ownership has finally caught up and his salary has came up a little bit here, but I think he's still a good play because he has a fantastic matchup. So I like Justin Fields from the Chicago Bears playing the Detroit Lions, who have the absolute worst defense overall. They give up the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Justin Fields has averaged 19.5 fantasy points per game on the season. And I like this pick because he's getting an average of 10.1 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 16% owned. Projected at 20.3 fantasy points here in Week 10. He's 6,500 DraftKings salary, 1,800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48.5 points scored in this game, with the Bears favored by 2.5. Justin Fields has scored 46, 26, and 24 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 15, 8, and 14 rush attempts in those games. He's been on fire. It's like you're getting a quarterback and a running back in the same play here, or the same pick. salary is still pretty reasonable considering his recent performance and the matchup. And Vegas thinking this is going to be a somewhat high scoring game and a close competitive game. So a lot going for Justin Fields here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So studs on the slate, of course, you got Saquon Barkley, who's in a fantastic spot here versus the Houston Texans. I like Derrick Henry, Nick Chubb, but the stud that I think is interesting this week, because you're going to save some salary with this pick, ownership is going to be low compared to what it normally is, and he has a fantastic matchup. I like Jonathan Taylor from the Indianapolis Colts playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have the third worst defense overall. They give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Jonathan Taylor has averaged 12.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 17.8 rush attempts per game and 4.2 pass targets per game. Only going to be about 7% owned, projected at 14 fantasy points here in week 10. He's 7,500 DraftKings salary, 500 less on FanDuel. So I like that FanDuel price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 41 points scored in this game, with the Colts trailing by 4.5. Now, Jonathan Taylor has scored 7 and 16 fantasy points in his last 2 games, off of 16 and 10 rush attempts and 1 and 8 pass targets. Didn't play last week, but there's no injury concerns here. He is fully healthy, and it's a somewhat risky play here only because their offense is struggling. They don't know who's going to be quarterback, or they're in a quarterback competition. They've got their offensive line is... Okay, guys, it's time to announce the winner of our $25 weekly PayPal giveaway. And the winner is Kyle Harler. Kyle Harler, congratulations. You are the winner of this week's $25 PayPal giveaway. Please reply to our comment to collect your prize.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Shuffled around a little bit, but I think this is a good play here just because the ownership is low. The matchup is great, and I think this is going to be a volume play. I think Jonathan Taylor is going to get 20 plus rush attempts here. So if he can crack this weak Las Vegas Raiders defense, he could have a big night. So I like Jonathan Taylor here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Oh, I also like Alvin Kamara, and of course I've been talking about him all week. Travis Etienne from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the Kansas City Chiefs. He's a fantastic play. He scored 30, 28, and 23 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks off of 28, 24, and 14 rush attempts on top of 2, 3, and 5 pass targets. Gonna be about 23% owned, projected at 19 fantasy points. He's 7,100 DraftKings salary, 900 more on FanDuel. So I like Travis Etienne here versus the Kansas City Chiefs. But now if you want to save a little bit of salary here at running back, take a look at Damon Pierce from the Houston Texans playing the New York Giants, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing running backs. Damon Pierce has averaged 16 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 18.5 rush attempts per game and 3 pass targets per game. So tons of volume, and he's going to be about 23% owned, projected at 15.9 fantasy points here in week 10. He's 6,300 DraftKings salary, 1,400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 40.5 points scored in this game, with the Texans trailing by 4.5. Damon Pierce has scored 17, 14, and 16 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 27, 15, and 20 rush attempts. He got 0, 5, and 4 pass targets in the last 3 games. So monster volume, reasonable price tag, decent matchup. So I like Damon Pierce here versus the New York Giants. Now, one of my favorite running back plays here, because of the low salary and the volume and the upside and the matchup, I like Jamal Williams from the Detroit Lions playing the Chicago Bears, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the second most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Jamal Williams has averaged 15.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 15.8 rush attempts per game, 1.5 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 11% owned, projected at 16 fantasy points here in Week 10. He's $5,900 DraftKings salary, $1,500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48.5 points scored in this game, with the Lions trailing by 2.5. So Jamal Williams has scored 10, 23, and 8 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 24, 10, and 15 rush attempts in those games. He got 0, 3, and 1 pass targets in those games. So he got 24 rush attempts last week. Now only had 10 fantasy points to show for it, but now he's got a fantastic matchup. Salary is still low, so I think he's got some pretty good upside here. So I like Jamal Williams here versus the Chicago Bears. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. So my favorite stud on the slate is Stephon Diggs, but then you got Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, Jalen Waddle, Chris Olave. But the wide receiver that I really like this week is Amari Cooper from the Cleveland Browns playing the Miami Dolphins, who have the 6th worst defense overall. They give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Amari Cooper has averaged 16.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.3 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 83% of the snaps, going to be about 11% owned, projected at 16.5 fantasy points here in Week 10. He's $6,500 DraftKings salary, $1,300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Browns trailing by 3.5. Amari Cooper has scored 26, 10, and 14 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 7, 4, and 12 pass targets. So I like Amari Cooper here versus the Miami Dolphins.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Now, if you want to save some salary at the wide receiver position, take a look at Jerry Jeudy from the Denver Broncos playing the Tennessee Titans, who have the 8th worst defense overall. They give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Jerry Jeudy has averaged 12 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.8 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 7% owned. He's been on the field for 74% of the snaps, projected at 12.9 fantasy points here in Week 10. He's $5,700 DraftKings salary, $700 more on FanDuel. Now, the only one knock on this pick is Vegas thinks this is going to be a low-scoring game. 38.5 points scored in this game, with the Broncos trailing by 2.5. But Jerry Jeudy has scored 18, 17, and 8 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 7, 11, and 7 pass targets. Fantastic matchup. The price tag is just right here at $5,700 DK salary and $700 more on FanDuel. So I like Jerry Jeudy here versus the Tennessee Titans. Now, another pick you can go with to save some salary. I think he's got plenty of upside. Fantastic matchup. Take a look at Darnell Mooney from the Chicago Bears playing the Detroit Lions, who have the absolute worst defense overall. They give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Darnell Mooney, he's averaged 8.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.8 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 88% of the snaps, going to be about 12% owned, projected at 11 fantasy points here in Week 10. But he's only $5,500 DraftKings salary, $700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48.5 points scored in this game, with the Bears favored by 2.5. Darnell Mooney has scored 18, 12, and 8 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks off of 8, 5, and 6 pass targets. Got one rush attempt last week as well. I think he makes a nice stack with Justin Fields. So I like Darnell Mooney here versus the Detroit Lions. Now, real quick, I also like Christian Kirk. I think Juju Smith-Schuster's in a good spot with Mecole Hardman out. He could get some extra pass targets. He got 12 pass targets last game, scored 19 fantasy points. Actually, his last 3 weeks have been fantastic. Scored 19, 28, and 25 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks, off of 12, 8, and 5 pass targets. And the Jaguars are giving up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. He's $6,000 DraftKings salary, $1,000 more on FanDuel. Gonna be about 13% owned. He could be a good stack with Patrick Mahomes. So I like Juju Smith-Schuster here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. So I like Travis Kelce, TJ Hawkinson, Zach Ertz. But if you want to save some salary at the tight end position, take a look at Pat Freiermuth from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the New Orleans Saints, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. Now, they've been pretty good versus opposing tight ends, but Pat Freiermuth has averaged 10.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.9 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 69% of the snaps, going to be about 8% owned, projected at 10.6 fantasy points here in Week 10. Only $4,200 DraftKings salary, $1,400 more on FanDuel, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 40.5 points scored in this game, with the Steelers trailing by 1.5. So Pat Freiermuth has scored 10 and 16 fantasy points in the last 2 games off of 7 and 9 pass targets. So I like that volume for the price tag. So I like Pat Freiermuth here versus the New Orleans Saints. Now I also like Greg Dulcich from the Denver Broncos. He's only $3,400 DraftKings salary. Now he is $2,500 more on FanDuel. So I love that price tag. He's going to be about 14% owned. And Greg Dulcich has scored 13, 11, and 12 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 5, 9, and 3 pass targets. So I like Greg Dulcich here versus the Tennessee Titans. I also like Evan Ingram from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the Kansas City Chiefs, who have the 5th worst defense overall. They give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Evan Ingram has averaged 8.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.2 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 75% of the snaps, going to be about 8% owned, projected at 8.4 fantasy points here in Week 10. He's only $3,300 DraftKings salary. He's $1,600 more on FanDuel. And we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 50.5 points scored in this game, with the Jaguars trailing by 9.5. So it could turn into a passing game script. Evan Ingram could get a handful of targets here. So he scored 2, 16, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 2, 6, and 7 pass targets. So I like Evan Ingram here versus the Kansas City Chiefs. Okay, now with Darren Waller out, I like Foster Moreau from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the Indianapolis Colts, who have a good defense overall, but they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Now, Foster Moreau, I don't know what happened to my voice right there. Foster Moreau has averaged 5.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.5 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 16% owned, and he's he's projected at 8.1 fantasy points here in week 10. Only $3,200 DraftKings salary. He is $2,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 41 points scored in this game, with the Raiders favored by 4.5. Now, Foster Moreau only scored 5, 9, and 6 fantasy points in the last 3 games, but he did get 5, 9, and 5 pass targets. So, excellent volume for the low price tag and a good matchup. So, I like Foster Moreau here versus the Indianapolis Colts.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.